today I'm talking to you about a very sensitive topic in the sense of whether the legislation or the policy imperatives in the country is suitable or sufficient in order for us to do the science that we want to do. I might just turn off the video just in case things go a little wonky. So essentially what I've been asked to do is to look at South Africa, where we are at the moment, the United Nations Oceans Decade, which has the theme, the science we need for the ocean we want, and whether the legislative framework that we have in the country is sufficient in order to do so. And I must put out a caveat. I normally am a scientist and scientific presentations, but today I'm dabbling in the laws of the country. So I hope I can give you some kind of an idea of what the policy framework is at the moment. So don't be surprised if there's no pretty pictures. All right. Okay, so we have to start off with the Constitution. And in section 24, which talks to the environment, says that everyone has the right to an environment that is not harmful to their health and well-being. And it should be protected for the benefit of present and future generations. And particularly against measures such as preventing pollution and ecological degradation, promote conservation, and secure ecologically sustainable development as we use our natural resources. Therefore, the state is responsible to put in place meaningful legislative tools to protect the environment, conserve ecosystems, and ensure the safekeeping and health of the environment. However, a caveat right at the beginning is to say that the Constitution also gives rise to a system of governance at national, provincial, and local government levels through the devolution of power and implementation at these different levels. So certain priorities will sit with national, others will sit with provincial, and implementation generally happens at local government level. So environmental protection and the conservation post-1994, we specifically been asked to talk here today about NEMA, or the National Environmental Management Act. So the Act was developed to provide for cooperative environmental governance and principles for decision-making on matters that would affect the environment. So here we're looking at just how a co-management through the different spheres of government can work in order for us to effectively implement these policies. So this is the main environmental statute in South Africa, and that's NEMA. And under the principles of the Act, Chapter 1 in Section 2, it says there is a need for decision-making to be based on the best information available to ensure environmental integrity is not compromised, just as the previous speaker has said. So this legislation also allows us for coordination, enforcement, and legal instruments to maintain the environmental integrity. And therefore, NEMA then gave rise to a subsequent set of legislation that deals with very specific matters of environmental concern, and that must adhere to the same principles of NEMA. And for this talk, specifically around the best information possible. Subsequent legislative tools then was what everyone calls NEMPA, which is the Protected Areas Act, to provide for the protection and conservation of ecologically viable areas representative of South Africa's biodiversity, natural landscape, and seascapes. Then the other one is NEMBA, which is more around the management and conservation of biodiversity within the framework of NEMA. There's the Air Quality Act, and this is to look at the regulation of air quality to protect the environment, as well as giving us inhabitants the the comfort that our air quality is considered important. And I think at this point, it becomes extraordinarily important that the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment is fully supportive of an Earth systems approach in terms of their management and science to inform that management. And then the Integrated Coastal Management Act that was established to look at an integrated way of managing coastal and estuarine environments within the Republic, to give rise to norms and standards. But again, to control issues such as dumping at sea, pollution in the coastal zone, and inappropriate development within the coastal zone. So I think what we're trying to do here is to say that here are the policy or legislative instruments in place to ensure that the environment is protected. And I think that right in the beginning, we need to talk about sustainable development. So NEMA gives us the suite of legislation that tries to deal with issues such as conservation and protection of biodiversity, the coastline, sustainable use of resources, etc. But what this does allow is three potentially very different approaches. The first one being when a decision for management is taken for conservation and protection only, when the management decision is about sustainable use, that is generally the use of natural resources, make sure that it is sustainable. And by that, we mean that there is a balance between what you're allowed to do to a point where it doesn't affect the environment negatively. And the third one being the precautionary approach. And that essentially is an approach that says, in the absence of a full suite of environmental information, the management decision would rather err on the side of caution as opposed to any of the other. Related to this, of course, is the Marine Living Resources Act. And this was to provide conservation of marine ecosystems and long-term sustainable utilization, particularly of the fisheries resource. And here, it was within this act that within the marine environment was the first time that there was a principle of an ecosystems approach, where the environmental information played an equally important part in how to sustain the access to this resource. Of course, this was at the same time when NEMA was promulgated. So there was an establishment of an intrinsic link between protection and sustainable use. And therefore, the call and the need for environmental data and information was prioritized. Now, within the marine context, other than for fisheries, at the time, through the Marine Living Resources Act, ocean governance and ecosystem protection was fragmented between different pieces of legislative instruments. This particularly became evident when there was a macro reorganization of the state. And environment was then removed from fisheries, and fisheries became part of an agriculture department. So what we were left with was legislation of environmental protection that sat with a different department. So obviously, from the high water mark seaward, there is an expectation that this is a national competency and not a provincial and local government competency. However, we all know that the marine environment is impacted on by many activities that happen on land and finds its way in some signature way into the marine environment. So, for example, marine protected areas were addressed through NEMA, NEMPA, as well as the MLRA, and this fragmentation was further enhanced during this macro reorganization in 2010. Well, since then, we've been put back together again. But what this fragmentation meant was that we needed to address the development of a national environmental management for oceans. And this gave rise to a white paper in 2014 dealing specifically with the marine environment holistically, as well as using an existing legislation to enhance this marine aspects. For this reason, the white paper on the national environmental management of the oceans in 2014 was an important piece of legislation that we put together, at least that now it's a policy instrument, because things started happening after that. The specific issue here with the white paper was it started looking at how to do ocean governance within and outside of our national jurisdiction along the principles of sustainable use and management, protection and conservation, the precautionary approach to both conservation and sustainable use, prevention, avoidance, and mitigation against pollution, using the principle of the polluter pays, strengthening human capacity, identifying economic opportunities, and of course, promoting collaboration and ecosystem and an earth systems approach. This became quite important because the themes that we started seeing coming through the white paper was around ocean environment information, which is something Juliet referred to earlier, knowledge for sustainable development. Now, of course, the development of a decision support tool is an important thing because it takes a host of potentially complex environmental variables and puts them into context for an easy decision support tool, which helps in terms of the management process. Environmental management, obviously that would be the responses to the information and the knowledge, and environmental integrity. This then gave rise to Operation Pakisa, or the Ocean Economy Strategy, and the subsequent Marine Spatial Planning Act that happened in 2018. What was realized when we drafted the white paper was that the most common thread through all of these legislative tools, whether it be NEMA and its subsequent specific environmental management tools, all had a strong dependency on the best quality research, data, and information to inform that management decision. And let alone all the national legislative tools, there were also international obligations that needed to be considered in terms of the management decision. And here we talk about the CBD, which is the Convention for Biological Diversity. There's things around Antarctica, there is things around the Indian Ocean, etc., etc. So all of these then are a plethora of legislative policy tools at our disposal, but they all require good data and information. Now, when we look at where we are and not only focus on our EEZ, but the entire ocean space around us that influences us directly when you look at an Earth systems approach, the area is vast. The triggers, the environmental triggers are vast. There are things that happen or processes that happen within the EEZ, but there are also influences from outside the EEZ onto our country. So as we look at all of these, we also have to recognize that the country has a difficult set of socioeconomic challenges. Our decision and our decision support and our management response has to be sensitive to alleviation of poverty, economic growth, and when unemployment amongst the youth. So it's a very difficult scale to balance, but all of those must be taken into consideration whenever we want to do a management intervention. So our approach cannot be fragmented across all spheres of government, all entities involved in research, as well as science councils. But the one thing that we've learned was that the policy must be flexible. No policy can be written and never change, because as information and science become available, we must adjust how we do our management intervention. Now, amongst all of this, the fragmented approach, the vast area of concern, the difficult socioeconomic challenges, we then still have to do all of this with climate change adaptation and mitigation. And as we know, the best policy response to climate change and adaptation is to have the best scientific information available within your space that you are. International things, such as the IPCC, they give you a global view, but as soon as you go down to a national, regional level, you have to look at what would best suit us as a country. So therefore, no single department or no single entity, science council, university, research institution can do this alone. There has to be a cooperative approach if we want to do anything in the ocean space, specifically around addressing the socioeconomics as well as the climate uncertainties that are coming. Now, that is the South African context. And then now there is the United Nations Ocean Decade, or the Decade of Ocean Science in support of sustainable development, which is one of 17 sustainable development goals. And the one dealing with oceans is Sustainable Development Goal 14, life below water. But we also know that oceans have linkages with other SDGs, such as food security, climate, education, etc. So there's that needs to be taken into account as well. And the Ocean Decade was then developed by the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, together with some of the international science bodies, to develop a science plan to implement. So there are essentially 10 decade challenges. It is to understand and beat marine pollution, protect and restore the ecosystem and biodiversity, sustainably feed your people, develop a sustainable and equitable ocean economy, unlock ocean-based solutions, increase community resilience, expand the global ocean observing system, create a digital representation of the ocean, skills development, and then changing our relationship with the ocean. Now, if I go through the list of decadal challenges, which was then used to develop the African approach, when I look back at the talks before mine, you will see that by and large, South Africa is dealing with these decade challenges even before they were made into this document. So the department, together with its partners, such as science and innovation, the suite of NRF institutions, universities, science councils, etc., we have in some way tackled each of these problems. But let me go through them and we'll look at what the challenges are around each of them. The first one, understand and beat marine pollution. We understand, and we do map land and sea-based sources of pollution and contaminants and their potential impacts on human health and ocean ecosystems. However, what we've done in a department together with our colleagues and partners has developed a coastal pollution monitoring program that morphed from what was originally the Muscle Watch project that started in the 1980s, looking at heavy metals, and expanded that into plastics, microplastic, organic pollutants, pH, and CO2, etc. And we are in the process of setting up a national pollution lab at the Walter Sisulu University. But that lab has been set up more to assist local governments in getting the information and the data back to them, specifically to their piece of the coastline. Of course, the challenge here is to do all of this at a national level. That is our biggest challenge. For example, we do a lot on the West Coast and on the South Coast, but we need to now extend this into a national program, looking at the same variables, the same frequency of sampling, and the same quality of analysis. The second challenge being to protect and restore ecosystems and biodiversity. South Africa is quite a leader in marine protected area establishment, where these are identified based on the best place to conserve a specific ecosystem and its components. The challenge would be is for a detailed and systematic catalog of all species at the genetic and biochemical level for the entire coastline. This becomes important, especially within a ocean economy perspective. For example, there are a lot of natural biochemical elements that could be used in pharmaceuticals. There is also some of the biochemical aspects of organisms for biofuel, etc. So there's a partnership between the department and some of the universities looking specifically at this. Our role is to look at biodiversity and biodiversity protection. Their role is to look at it further at the genetic and biochemical level. To protect and restore ecosystem biodiversity, there's multiple stresses on ecosystems to develop solutions to monitor, protect, and manage. This, I think, is one of the most important things, in the sense that there is a national strategy for science by the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, as well as the Department of Science and Innovation. And we try and cross-pollinate our policies so that the two departments who deal with the marine environment from a research perspective talks to each other. And I think the challenge is going to be aligning all of this with national interests. But I think a step forward that we have taken is that the two department director generals have agreed to set up a coordinating body between the two departments, so that where intervention is required, it has more of a holistic and cooperative approach instead of the duplication of effort within the country. Food security is another important aspect, and here sustainable fisheries. And under the ocean economy, there is a large drive along marine aquaculture. The data on environment fisheries interactions have a long history, but there are other challenges that we have here with overfishing and understanding the climate impacts. However, the marine environment, again, becomes a very important aspect, especially if you want to do in situ marine aquaculture, for which our coastline is not really well set up for. At the moment, most of the aquaculture happens on land. A equitable ocean economy, here it's obviously to address economic development, but doing it in a sustainable way, to make sure that the data is being collected by all sectors. And here the challenge would be measuring all these variables needed nationally in a very coordinated approach. Ocean-based solutions to climate change. I think here this is fairly new in our research, and I think this is where Andrew Green and his team could potentially play a vital role in terms of carbon capture. The impacts of these, we don't understand. We don't have a full understanding of this ocean climate nexus, because the feeling is that as soon as you do something in the Earth system, the effects then travel to the other components of the Earth system. So we have to be careful when we do that. I think the previous talk spoke well about community resilience to climate change, but here, technological advancement, engineering is not always the solution. We have to look at other ways of understanding this. Expanding the global ocean observing system, I think Juliet spoke to that. We just simply here, long-term monitoring becomes an important component, which we have for a number of EOVs, or essential ocean variables, and there are new variables being monitored by partners. And I think if we want to have a national view of things, this is going to be very important. However, the challenge is, do we have enough human and technological capacity to do this? In my view, I don't think that this sort of science is funded at an appropriate level. And here, I think we can draw very quickly from what we've learned from the COVID-19 experience, is that if you do the right kinds of science, when there is no challenge, when the challenge happens, you are so much closer to a solution. And I think that's the message that we, within our branch of the department, is constantly pushing. The digital representation of the ocean, I think this is a multi-stakeholder collaboration. This is ongoing with partners at the moment, particularly within our marine information management and oceans and coast information management system. We need to increase the science, knowledge, and technology, and I think this is one way of doing this is this very close collaboration between the DSI and the DFFE. I think that's very important. And then, of course, changing how we see the ocean. South Africa was always seen as a country of farmers and miners, but I think that needs to change, especially if we want to have an ocean economy, because you don't want to do something at the expense of the environment. So in conclusion, I think the family of NEMA legislative tools is sufficient to deal with the challenges. I think from a legislative and policy framework, South Africa is quite thorough and we're good at landmark legislation and policy. The problem comes with implementation. That is the greatest challenge. How do we coordinate national effort? Hopefully, this DSI, DFFE coordination mechanism will go some ways in doing so. How to best bridge the resource constraint in order to have the best available information is one of our greatest challenges. And to have local knowledge on the influences of climate adaptation and mitigation strategies. And just my parting note to Andrew is, you'll see maybe in the next week or two that the department is now looking at replacing its smaller research vessel with a full environment geologically capable vessel. So hopefully within the next 3 years or so, you will have 2 vessels with multi-beam capability and full geological survey capability. Thanks.
Okay, Gordon Branson says, thank you for the very informative presentation. Nested in the legal framework, my question is related to your point on budgets and finance availability. What does financial success to achieve ocean success look like? Would you like to answer that?
Yeah. In my view, I think the resource allocation, particularly for marine sciences and its related spheres of science, I think the way that we do this is still in the context of a country that sees itself as farmers and miners. So I think in terms of the national departments, especially within science and technology, which gets quite a nice sum of the fiscus that comes from the central government, I think if we as a scientific community, whether you're governmental or not, or an academic, we need to start looking at how best to address issues of national interest. Because issues of national interest will get you the funding that you need, and if it's in a coordinated and collaborative way. I think between the different departments, this is really why we set up the forum between the DSI and the DFFE, because if you do not make the appropriate investment, you will not have the appropriate responses and answers to what you want. So I think in terms of investment in this kind of work will result in a country that can be better equipped in safeguarding its citizens and its economy. For me, that is a 1+1 question, and we shouldn't get anything other than 2. Thanks.